but welcome to this Zoom call here for you as alumni. I think it's a really critical issue that we're talking about today. Here's what we'll plan for today. Before I do that, I'm going to give some initial thoughts along with Terry. We'll just kind of throw a few ideas out here to you, and then we'll invite you to add your insights and your perspectives, because we do not have this topic fully formed. In fact, the plan is later this month to have a public webinar about critical thinking. But I wanted to have you as alumni speak into that before I actually prepare the webinar totally. And then I'd also like to make it into a deep dive that can be offered even more detail. So I'm just going to welcome all of you that would like to contribute into what we're going to be doing here. So I'll begin by sharing my screen and a little bit of a presentation here as we start up. I grew up in India, and I saw people who were illiterate and how vulnerable they were. They were open to manipulation, outright fraud. They had no way of knowing what they were signing, what they were agreeing to. And it's a terrible thing to see people being taken advantage of because they just can't read. But today I'd like to talk about another kind of illiteracy, and that's when you're able to read and write, but you can't think critically. And I observed that people are just as vulnerable with this problem as they would be if they couldn't read at all. In fact, maybe a little bit more vulnerable in that if we don't know how to think, we can arrive at very firm conclusions on something and be dead wrong. So we really need, especially in these days, to make sure that we're thinking critically about things and that we're not just reacting. But when you look at the population today, there is such extreme positions on things that really shows that, quite frankly, there's a lot of people who are reacting rather than reflecting and not actually processing well. So today, let's talk about critical thinking. And just as an initial little points that I want to point out here is that what we're talking about really is a search for truth. Critical thinking is looking to sort out all of the information and mix-ups and say we want to find the truth. But while we do that, no one can say that we have 100% of the truth. No one can say that. Let's not pretend that any of us have 100% truth. We need to stay humble, willing to learn, open to new information that can help inform us, at the same time, not being naive, being able to actually really think through some things. So I'm inviting Terry to just comment as we go along as well. Terry, what else would you say about critical thinking in this search?
Well, I think critical thinking always involves a process, and that involves time of stepping back and taking time to observe, taking time to weigh options. And it's that critical that critical point of stepping back that I think is often lost in today's rapid kind of high-paced world, is that we become accustomed to wanting to find what we consider to be the truth quickly.
Yeah.
So we lose the humility. We also lose that step of process to ponder, to carefully and deliberately think issues through. So
yeah. Not jumping to conclusions. Wow. Right. That's for sure. In fact, here's a next factor that might make people jump to conclusions, because there are some impediments to critical thinking that short circuit this whole process you just talked about, Terry. And that is when coercion is applied, you have to deal with it because it's coerced, and you have to decide quickly, even though you haven't thought it through. And if there's manipulation involved, that if you make a decision and you don't make the right one, that you can have problems, that induces fear. And fear, for many people, will induce fight, freeze, or flight. And we've seen all three of those happening in our day here. These are just some of the impediments that I'm seeing come up here as stopping critical thinking. Any other things that you see, Terry?
It's very interesting that coercion, if there's leaders or if there is some influence within a society that uses coercion manipulation, it can cause fear. But to reverse it, when people are living with fear and anxiety, it makes them susceptible to greater coercion manipulation.
Yeah.
There's a writer, Matthias Desmet, who is an expert. I think he's out in Holland. He's an expert in mass formation. So he has studied for years, how is it that a whole group of people, a society even, can fall into a hypnotic state of following along with thinking and adopting thinking that on the face of it, you look at it and says, this is crazy that people would think this way. His point is that when people are fearful and anxious, they're looking for some way to mitigate that anxiety and fear. If there is an ideology or if there is a voicing of something that says, here's a solution to this fear and anxiety, this is where mass formation begins to occur, and they become susceptible to coercion and manipulation of leaders, of powerful elites or powerful intellectuals, because the psychology is we're looking for something to help us with our fear. Mm-hmm. So they're then given, here's the problem. The problem is this group of people. The problem is, the people who think this way. The problem is these people. They're the enemy. And what Desmet says, it is amazing to see what people will do in terms of turning against people who have been identified as the enemy. And he says there's a psychological kind of gain from that, is that it gives people a handle to say, okay, now I can know that my fear and anxiety can be dealt with because we now identify who are the bad people. So coercion manipulation plays to fear. It also creates fear. So it's a fascinating field of study. And I think it really plays into what's happening today, is that there are people who lose the faculty of critical thinking. They become susceptible to messages that allow them to put a handle on how they can manage their fear. And they don't think anymore. They don't think about, options. They think, I've got the answer. And that actually serves a good purpose to help them reduce their fear.
Reduce anxiety.
Yep. So mass anxiety, it's social contagion, emotional contagion that actually hijacks good thinking.
Yes. In fact, let's just talk about the kinds of issues that actually is reflected in what you just said there, Terry. There's really three kinds of issues. The first one has to do with information, and it's interesting that we're hearing this more in the public media these days. We talk about there's information which would be open, transparent, honest, just straightforward conversation about information. And then there's misinformation, which is unintentional mistakes in the content or in some of the assumptions. And then we're hearing about disinformation, which is purposely misleading. And then another fourth one has been added, apparently, malinformation, intended to actually purposely, harm. So we've got an issue around what is true here now, because we thought, at least we assumed before, that when you had information that's public, that it would be of that first category. But we're finding out it's not actually. We need more discernment than that, because there are three kinds of problems as well that kind of parallel these issues. There are problems to solve that just require ordinary, straightforward, transparent, honest communication. You solve a problem. But then there are sometimes you solve the wrong problem unintentionally, and you're working hard at something, but it's actually the wrong thing. And then it goes to the third one, which is solving the wrong problem on purpose. And so now we're really getting into this whole bizarre area. Well, what in the world is true? What in the world is the point here, because I want to add even a fourth one. If you've ever read history, and this is not the first time coaches have gone through this. Let's just say that right up front too. When you read history, there's actually a fourth one, and that is it's the complete bizarre, like something so completely outside and beyond any normal paradigm that people would just not know. That there's no way that's happening. There's no way that could be, and there's an immediate dismissal, which actually allows those who have malintent to just label, anybody that disagrees as conspiracy, or, you're stupid to think that. But actually bizarre things have happened in history. And those who have read history are less susceptible to being manipulated today. So I think we've got current issues happening all around us. I'm going to invite Terry actually to just speak a little bit to this screen right here, and then we'll open it up for others of you to join in. I'm sure you've got something you're thinking about.
Well, I think those words on the left side there, they've been in the lexicon very much in recent days, and even those words are used for particular ends.
Yeah.
So one of the ways that someone, for example, if someone looks at an issue and says, I've been thinking hard about this and I've been thinking critically about it, and I look at it and I think it's more nuanced and more, I think there's this and this and this to see, even the words misinformation, disinformation are then brought out to say, well, you're just spouting disinformation.
Mm.
So even the process of someone critically reflecting, deliberately thinking about something is shut down by the use of these kind of, they're now a missive. It's a word that can be brought out like a weapon to say, oh, you're just simply spreading misinformation or disinformation. Yeah. Shame on you. You need to be quiet. So it's quite an environment that we're in.
Yeah, you got a good point there. That if you're going to do critical thinking, you're going to have to think of both sides of the issue.
Right.
And that sometimes is disallowed by some. Say, you can't think of this side. That's not allowed. That's disinformation.
Yeah.
Wow. So that means you can't think critically because you need to be able to actually weigh all ideas for a while.
Right.
That's very good.
You go back to H.G. Wells and the 1984 and other things that were written way back when, Ministry of Truth, you begin to see his use of this idea that people need to understand groupthink. They also need to be very aware of being independent thinkers. So there are thought crimes. So even in our present culture, to think certain things, believe certain things, say certain things are brought out as actual crimes. They're violence to say and think certain things. You realize we're not far from this kind of thought police idea that is not in some kind of government system presently, but it's in the air. And this is how ideologies work, is that ideologies are, as Edmund Burke said, they are armed doctrines, and ideologies do not get on the playing field in order to agree to disagree. They actually are on the field to win a battle. And to win that battle, they'll say to people, you need to have the right information. Anything else you say other than the information we give you is disinformation, misinformation. And what happens is that there's a sociologist many years ago who said that the individual soul in the masses can become completely overtaken by the group soul. So that group think is not a myth. It's not some kind of idea on the margin. And the uniformization is accompanied by an almost absolute loss of rational thinking and the ability for critical reflection. As one writer says, even among people who under normal circumstances are extremely intelligent and capable of well-founded criticism, it's accompanied by a strong tendency to surrender to impulses that under normal circumstances would be considered radically crazy or radically unethical. So we're into the bizarre in terms of the things that we're being told that we must say about men and women. That's just one example. It's outside any normal paradigm, but if you don't say it, you are then, the missives are brought out, the labels are used. It's not misinformation or disinformation. It was bigotry. It is violence. And you shake your head and say, well, it seems that something's been disconnected, and it is critical reflection. critical thinking.
Mm.
So,
yeah. So we never seen this and I've never seen this in my lifetime. So it does incumbent upon us as Christian leaders. We are people who are searching for the truth. We find the truth in Jesus Christ and God himself, but we look for that light, that truth, this search after the true to permeate all of our life. So if anybody should be thinking critically and well, it should be Christian believers. But I find that there's still extreme reactions emotionally and everything amongst Christian folks. So it's an issue that we need to think about. So I want to ask any of you here, the rest of you, here's a couple of questions that might help us get our discussion going. Well, the first one is, what alerts you that something's not right? We all do have little alerts within our thinking, within our heart, that makes you pause. Say, yeah, I'm not quite sure. Like, how does that work for you? And then how do you sort out the true from false? It'd be really interesting to hear all of us pitch in some of our ways of dealing with this today. So invite you all. This is unscripted and wide open. Let's hear from you. What do you think?
I'll just give you an example if I can.
Sure.
During the COVID restrictions, then we were told to distance. We were told to stay at home, all that stuff. But at some point, it got to a point where it's not that I'm worried about me giving up freedoms. I'm now, by withdrawing my ministry, I'm hurting people, right? So for example, in our thrift store, we have a lot of seniors working there. The community, or their community, comes from gathering together, to being in the same place, to interacting. And at some point, they were really suffering because that was withdrawn. And at some point, I could say, I can stay home. I got my family at home, my children are at home. We're not suffering, we're being inconvenienced. But out there's people suffering and I'm doing nothing about it. I'm alerted something is wrong.
Okay, something alerted you there in that one. Good. Yeah.
I just read something yesterday that helps me be aware of one of my sensitivities. The statement was, please do not exalt yourself by depreciating me.
Yeah.
And when I hear comments that include depreciating of somebody else, even somebody else I don't agree with necessarily, but I think, there's something being camouflaged here. We're trying to be deceived somehow.
Yep. For me, Canada has been, whenever someone uses a label or a category or some kind of way to broad brush a group of people, my spidey senses tingle and I go, okay, something's going on here, because we use labels and categories for a very specific purpose, and that's to control, to exercise power over. Doesn't matter in what direction they go.
I agree with both of those comments, and my observation is that immature character, the default setting of our brains, is everything Jesus is trying to help us outgrow, for instance, in Luke 6, 27 to 46-ish. So our default setting is to be focused on ourselves and our own needs, to label enemies, and then to judge, blame, criticize, and get even, and excuse ourselves from loving them because they're our enemies. And so that's a default setting, and we're all capable of it in our worst moments, even if we've matured beyond that. And so that is one reason why I don't see any more maturity in the church, because a lot of people have not been intentional followers of Jesus, but more of followers of a creed and doctrines. And I've met a lot of people who have actually outgrown that in many ways. So there are 3 stages of psychological development. One of them is the socializing self, where people just believe what everybody else, the consensus around them, that's a safe thing to believe to fit in. That's like junior high. And that's also a default setting. And then the next level is the authorizing self. And that's where people do form independent opinions on things. But the problem is then they use a filter. Anything that doesn't agree with what they already think is disconfirmation and confirmation bias. And if they can get a bunch of people who agree with them, they're even more sure they're right. Those people are really dangerous when they have power because they just collect unto them the same thinkers. So the type of thinking you described, Dan, of what the kind of persons we need to be is the transforming self level. And less than 10% of people achieve that. And the transforming self level acknowledges, yeah, I'm wrong. Even when I'm really, really smart about something, I'm probably 20% wrong. And so is open to hearing ideas from others and is open to seeing an issue from more than 2 sides, because there's always more than 2 sides. There's not a right and a wrong and a black and a white and a vaccine or no vaccine or mask or no mask. There are always many complicating sides to the issue. Those are just some of my thoughts.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for people that I can see, just like you said, that are trying to understand and not being quick to judge and label and blame.
Very good.
I think it's so good to remind us that Jesus came as the great philosopher of life to say, I'm calling you to a way and to a wisdom that leads you to the good. And as I've been thinking about it recently, the Christian faith is really a faith of robust thinking. When you actually look through the New Testament, I mean, Paul says, don't be conformed. So the conformity issue is what you said, is that socialized self, the authorizing self that so often is conformity, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Paul, when he prays, I pray that your love may abound in all wisdom and depth of insight. He prays in Colossians for the Colossian believers that they would be the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and insight. So we're actually called to a very robust thinking within the center of our faith. And some people would say, well, your Christian faith is sort of a non-thinking thing. It's just a faith thing. Actually, no. We're called to wrestle and think very deeply, to be enlightened, our eyes enlightened. And I think we've missed something about developing the rigor within Christian discipleship. You're called to be a thinker.
Well, just a reflection back on that one, I would think that any evangelical leader, any Bible-believing leader would totally agree with you. But I'm wondering if maybe their robust thinking is just theological, and they don't actually apply those same things to things beyond the Bible, to life, to relationships, to knowledge. And so I think we can find Orthodox Christians who say they're thinking critically, they're thinking robustly, but it's just within this little box we call our doctrine.
And further to that, I see the tendency that those who do consider themselves to have robust thought, it can so easily then be used like a hammer. Again, another statement I just read here. 'Tis excellent to have a giant's strength. 'Tis tyrannous to use it like a giant.
Oh boy, very good. Who wrote that?
I'm not sure. I just saw it, and it was just a statement written in a commentary. But 'tis tyrannous to use it like a giant.
That's very good. Yeah.
And when I was in the academy, I used to say to myself, knowledge puffs up, but sometimes theological knowledge puffs up absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
It can actually be used in a way that is in its own way elitist and just condescending and used as a cudgel.
Yeah, because now I have God approving me now.
Well, more than that, it's my job to defend God.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes. You're
Yes, 'cause
yes, you're going against God if you disagree with me.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that was pointed out. This book, Mindset by Carol Dweck, just emphasizes that a lot of our education system is simply about teaching people to memorize the right answers. And that may be true as well in theological school and even in an undergraduate program, until you get to a doctorate, you're actually not being taught to think. You're being taught what to think. And so that is a problem. And if you think differently, you probably didn't do well in school. And if you got ahead in life, and you were a top scholar in school and you took away all kinds of awards in university, you probably did that by memorizing the right answers. And so you will proceed in whatever job or position that you have to continue to trust in your right answers.
Yeah. Wow.
I'm finding it's not so much education that is giving me freedom. It's the fact that as I get older, I start to think, I don't really care what other people think about me. I want to start thinking this through myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that go back to Verdine's 3 stages you talked about. The first stage is wanting social acceptance. And so I'm very aware, what will people think about me if I say this? And that's an immature stage. So I think, Ken, you're just kind of reaching the 3rd stage of transformation, and you're a search for truth regardless. Yeah, that's good.
I would give Ken way more credit than that, though, because we cycle through, and it's it's like an upward spiral or a downward spiral in life. And just this week, I had to deal with, I think of myself as very transformative. And just this week, I had to deal with my anxiety about what do people think.
Yeah.
And I think about an ancient sage that I met named Ethan Clark, and he had a favorite saying. Ethan, your saying has come to mind many times over the last 2 years. One of your favorite sermons titles of "People Suck." Sometimes I just think that.
Yeah.
My concern is, as I get older, I might get to the part where I can't even remember what they think about me.
No, that's a whole different stage.
So will that be a mug, Ethan, at some point with your,
Well, let's hear from Ethan. You've been quoted already here, Ethan. I'm sure you're thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, not one of my better quotes, probably, but I like with the critical thinking, and then being in leadership. One of the things that I've found is, a guy's got to have some confidence in his faith and kind of where he's at, and then with the people that you're dealing with, I find asking more questions and just kind of understanding, where they're coming from or what their backgrounds or their beliefs are, and you've got to consider all of that. And as a leader, I've found, even with COVID, your influence just by giving your opinion because of your position in leadership can be perceived as you kind of coercing people into thinking what you believe. And so early on in COVID, I was challenged by one of our staff related to a comment that I made. And, at that point, I had to start looking at how I said stuff because of the position that I'm in versus what my personal opinion is. And so I've started asking a lot more questions, and then I get to where they are, or they get to where I am, and it's without conflict. It's the old seek first to understand, then be understood. And just the whole questioning, asking questions, not, but asking them where it's not confrontational, but, well, why do you think that? Or where do you get that information? Just, you don't have to ask why, where too many times to the same question before they have to either
Yep.
They provide either a pretty solid foundation for where they're coming from, or you can determine that they picked it up and don't have a lot of defense for it. So it's been interesting. So.
Yeah. A few weeks ago, one of our MCL students told the story of being on a 12-hour car ride from Manitoba to Calgary with a group of friends she hadn't been with for a year or so. And she said, we were totally different, like just totally different perspectives on life, politics, and everything. And she said, I used questions. Right. And she said, have you heard about the following? Or what do you think of this? And she said it was a wonderful kind of journey. They didn't get into arguments because she wasn't coming up against their ideas. She was simply saying, well, have you considered this? Have you thought about this? And she said at certain points, at a number of points, they all said, I'd never heard about that before. And she realized we all live in an echo chamber of sorts, but they just had never heard of certain things. And it enlarged their understanding. You're right, Ethan, asking more questions.
The other thing that I
opens it up.
That through this whole COVID thing is that I have yet to sit through or observe any conversations where at the end of the conversation, somebody said, yeah, you're right, I was wrong. But my opinion, they don't change,
right.
Like not in a confrontational,
right.
Discussion or where you're challenging, kind of polar opposites. You have to, for people to change, there has to be information and backup and support and they have to get there themselves. You can't tell somebody they're wrong and walk away at the end of the conversation and say, yeah, you're right, I was wrong. And it's a journey for them as well.
Yeah.
So,
If it took you 6 months to come to a conclusion, they might need 6 months too. So one conversation is not likely to result in, oh man, you're right. Very good, Ethan. So Calvin, I'm sure you got some good thoughts too.
Well, a couple of things. The whole thinking, how do we think critically? Adam Grant's book, Think Again, he talks a little bit about how do we think well, and he talks about often we can be thinking either like the politician, the preacher, or the scientist. And the politician is how do we get votes, how do we get money, how do we get support, right? And the preacher is how do I spout the party line and convince people of that, of that truth, of that one way of looking at things. And then, but the scientist is saying, why am I wrong on this? What's the theory and what's wrong with how I'm thinking? Put the theory out and saying, so part of critical thinking is actually to have that ability or that courage to look at what we say we believe and say, okay, what's off with this? How is that not supported? How is it not fitting reality? How is it not fitting the whole scope of data that we have, and what's the data? And so that's a big part, I think, of critical thinking, is being able to criticize ourselves, to be able to say what is wrong with the point of view that I have, and recognizing that the point of view that we have has been shaped by our culture, by our family, by so many lenses that are not they're not truth. They're just our cultural interpretation of what we've been. So that's part of it. So what's off? What sort of tweaks me to what's off is the whole. When people are always framing things by the enemies, and that's it's such the politicized culture that we're in. Everything is, it's going to be, it's going to be an absolute disaster if that person gets in, or if that position wins, or if that politician gets in, and that really is something that I think is we have devolved to, and any of the headlines, sort of political at all, it's always what's the enemy and what's the problem if that enemy gets in. And that's certainly one of the things that are off.
Yep. Jonathan Haidt talks about one of the great myths or untruths of university campuses these days, and that is that the third untruth is that the world is made up of good people and bad people. And a lot of students are being raised in that environment, and then they're being told, here's what it means to be a good person. And then the thought frame is given, and anyone who doesn't think that is therefore evil. And it's entered into most of our society, politics, even the normal conversations on the street. We're looking for little tag words to figure out, okay, are you on the good side or on the bad side? And if you slip up and you say, well, I sort of vote maybe this way, oh, it's clear who you are.
Yeah.
And then the labels come out, categories come out. And it all reveals a lack, just a dearth of real thinking about things. The world is so much more nuanced, but we make it a math problem. And life's not a math problem.
So nuanced thinking requires us to be able to to examine a number of options and to hold them simultaneously in an abeyance while we're thinking and not having to jump to a conclusion. But for some people, that feels anxious.
Right.
They want certainty. They want it to be black or white. But what we're calling for is this higher level of thinking, critical thinking, where we can even arrive at a conclusion, but still hold it open that there might be more information that I don't know yet. And that openness, that humility to say, I'm still open to hear the truth on information. I think one of the disconcerting things for me now is that in our culture, the data is not being transparent anymore. When you don't have transparent, honest data, how do you then have any kind of robust thinking?
Yep.
Because good thinking requires data.
Yeah, I find even in the healthcare field as well, Kelvin, as you were talking about Adam Grant's book and how a scientist thinks, I saw a lot of scientists not thinking that way. And I see a lot of research that's out to prove a preconceived notion that's based on an untested assumption. So it is a complex world. There's a lot to sort through, and that was why when we were trying to implement provincial quality improvements to try to make things better, we had to try to understand what people already thought and believed, because their actions weren't going to change unless their assumptions did. So that was the fun of it, was trying to understand how we could challenge people's thinking without threatening them in a way that caused them to dig in and defend. And just, and that was also the magic of it, because then they grew and things got better. And so really, and you did see that some of the people that we had labeled as, oh my gosh, she said this, she's definitely not on our side. At some other points, they became some of our biggest supporters. And so it is the messiness of people as well. I think God sees all that messiness, and he's somehow in this swirl of all of us trying to think through things, he's still at work and he's still bringing us together. And it's just, it's not a very clean process.
Yeah. Now, I know, Dan, you came in just a little bit later in our conversation, but I'm wondering if you want to contribute anything. We actually, let me just show you, we had two questions that we were asking people to think about here. What alerts you that something's not right, that made you start thinking, hey, just a minute here? And how do you sort true from false? And that's our basic discussion we're trying to do here. So if you feel comfortable joining in, we'd love to invite you to comment too.
Yeah, in terms of what's alerting me to what is not so good, obviously signals and culture. I'm on board of one mission where my colleague in the US said I can't even go to church because the extreme hatred on one side or another is so bad, and I'm on staff. I can't even go to my own church. Oh. That's good.
Yep.
I work closely with a renowned medical doctor. I won't say the name, but he said his frustrations in trying to talk to people medically about the pandemic stuff. He said, basically said there's three categories of people related to vaccinations. He said the first the first are the leaders in the anti-vax movement. Second of all are those who follow them blindly. And then thirdly, those who are sort of on the fence. And he said, what frustrates me is I cannot, as a medical doctor, talk to people about medical stuff. It's
Yeah.
like they refuse to engage or to listen.
Yeah.
And so then he said to me, the evangelical community, which is my tribe, has been an embarrassment to the medical community. And yeah, I don't want to get into the side of it, but just the thinking side has been very frustrating. And an email I got last week from somebody who's an expert in their field and across the pond, basically gave no grace, just blasted me, demanded an apology, and has been rather unchristlike in terms of the communication. So the other person involved in this email chain just said, I can't even talk, you can't even reason, you can't. So those are some of the things that have alerted me to the problem. And that's just in one side. There's lots of other things too, lots of other areas we could talk about. Sometime in terms of how to sort out truth. I know that in the medical world, some people would just point to sort of an independent research, but you need to sort through, and sometimes they're not qualified to sort through the data. You need good data, but who's to say that, data can speak whatever you want it to speak? So that's another challenge. How do we interpret the data in a way that's just and true?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Data has become like stats. There are stats, and then there are how does it go? The last one is damned lies. So it's the whole how you
Mark
use
Twain,
it.
wasn't it? Was that Mark Twain?
Yeah.
There's statistics, and then there's statistics, and then there's damn lies.
Yeah.
But that quote points to the fact that if we don't have honest, transparent data, we are unable to have good conversations. And so
I think in terms of my own blind spots too, I just heard an interview of a CEO who realized that the very company he founded was going away from the mission and values, et cetera. And so he had the self-awareness to sort of realize that, to think critically about his own situation, to step aside and to process it and to make some changes back in the initial direction. So I think, that's good advice for me, just to be able to have that time of reflections in my own thinking, let alone others.
And then you did bring up a good point here that, like, the next piece, maybe the third question is, how do you talk to people without making it worse? That seems to be really tough today. And you're an example, Dan, of someone who's just so emotional that you cannot even talk with them. Boy, that's a warning sign for us. We as leaders, we've got to be able to stay open to people and willing to listen and willing to say, well, that's interesting. And even if we don't agree, but you don't have to argue. You don't have to conclude the ultimate truth in this particular conversation. It can be an ongoing journey. But, maybe others of you, how have you endeavored to talk to people about difficult things?
Well, I was just thinking about this, Dan, that truth is more than just data and facts.
True.
Truth is also our biblical Christ-like way that we value people.
Mm-hmm.
And I can debate facts, but I've already made up my mind that I want to treat you respectfully.
Very good.
And I live in that truth, and perhaps the value of people becomes the springboard by which we can create some leeway to actually talk about things we disagree on.
Yeah. If they sense that you value them and you're interested in hearing them, but you're also offering a discussion point, that can take the defenses down. Very good.
And sometimes a discussion over data needs to actually be prefaced by a declaration of my attitude toward you that won't change.
Very good.
There are also people who, in that socializing self or authorizing self level of development, you can be as positive as you want towards them. You're not going to win them over because they've already vilified you. And also out of their insecurity, it feels so good. Also, probably because you are so incredibly competent that you're a bit of a threat. It feels so good to focus on your faults. And so one of the things I think we have to do is recognize that we'll need filters for those people. Not all people are nice, and we can't win them all over. The Think Again book has a series of 5 questions that we can ask if we're in conversations with people, and some of them are what, like Ethan was talking about, what leads you to that assumption? Why do you think that's correct? What might happen if it's wrong? What are the uncertainties of your analysis? I understand the advantages of your recommendations. What are the disadvantages? So keeping in that that coaching approach of asking questions and challenging thinking when we have that option is really terrific. If you get in a group situation, like what you're talking about, Terry, we just had this nice little condo association of 26 owners had our AGM last week. And unbeknownst to us, there was a posse going on to take out the existing board. And they came, one of the guys doesn't read well, obviously, and he spiraled with some misinformation, got everybody worked up. And the only thing that he wanted to talk about was to attack the people instead of to address the issues. So it was a group situation that started out with a bunch of people just being, their emotions were too high. And so anyway, I mean, moving forward, it was the goal after that, but it wasn't a redeemable situation really. So it's just recognizing that when people are worked up about something or believing misinformation, then you're just managing that. You're staying calm, you're asking questions, but you're also taking note that,
so you could write a book, Verdine, The Condo Board.
What's it called? Condo Board?
The Condo Board, a microcosm of life.
Never bored with the Condo Board.
Never bored with the Condo Board. Yeah. Things I learned about life and leadership in the Condo Board.
That'll be bestseller, I'm sure.
Yeah.
One reality that I think is increasingly, I'm recognizing increasingly, I mean, talk about needing the data and looking at the data. And when we do that, we assume that because we have looked at data, that we're making a decision on a logical basis.
Yeah.
But we really aren't. We're usually making a decision on an emotional basis. I was flagged to that in that book, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And he says why good people are divided by politics and religion. And he talks about 5 moral centers, and people make an emotional decision, or 6 moral centers, on the basis of some of those moral centers. And recognizing that I'm making the basis, and it's probably on the basis of 1 or 2 of those more than some of the other ones. And the people that I'm disagreeing with are also making a moral decision from what they believe is the moral center. It's just a different set of moral centers that they're making. So we're both making an emotional decision, right? And we're all very good at being able to line up the data in order to make sure that our emotional decision looks like it's a logical one. And so recognizing that is a very important one. And so we need to really interrogate ourselves and say, why really do I believe this? And often it's because this is what I want to be true about this issue. And so that's really important. And part of that is recognizing, how do we approach people? I think one of the questions or the things that I have to have lodged in my mind is to say, what can I learn from that person? Because there's something in the perspective that I don't know, something in their perspective that I need to grow in. And so having that question that I'm asking myself, I think is very important in the dialogue, because that will help that respect and frame that respect in that person, and to be able to let them, and that comes through when people know that you respect them, that comes through in how we ask questions and what we ask.
We had a discussion about that in a faculty meeting a number of years ago, and I had faculty colleagues who had their opinion or perspective related to the U.S. and the whole issue of the border. And it was quite vitriolic towards people who held any position of there should be a border process that provides a secure border. And they saw that as racist. And in the conversation, we raised this thing, and I said, you don't understand that people who have a perspective towards the border are coming at it from a value base that is totally different than the value base of people who look at it as a human tragedy situation. Other people hold a firm value of law and order, that law and order has to mean something. Doesn't mean they don't care about the human piece, but it was quite a revelation to a few of them to go, okay, I guess I can understand that. But without that, they were simply labeling people and saying they're just racist. If they want a wall, they're racist. And they didn't understand people are coming at that from a totally different value base. So Haidt's work is fascinating. He's a liberal, liberal guy, but he's got some great insight in terms of how we need to understand each other much, much better.
Well, during these turbulent times is an opportunity for us to show mature leadership. So I'm glad to have each of you that came on the call here and others who are watching, because a good number of our alumni can't be always available at this particular time, but want to hear the recording. So we'll send this on to them, and we'll also make sure we put up the books that were just mentioned here. But it seems like we do have an opportunity to live and lead wisely, which can be a wonderful opportunity. But it seems like many leaders, including Christian leaders, have found this to be a little more challenging than what they're used to, and we just realized, man, we're not equipped for handling this, and we haven't done it well. So maybe some of our crest people can show the way. Appreciated the comments here. I want to honor the fact that it's an hour, and I asked for 60 minutes, so that's all we'll need to do here. So those of you that would need to go, please go, and with God's blessing. If there's any that want to stay on and keep talking, we'll stay on. Terry and I can, and whoever else, we'll keep chatting for a bit. But I want to acknowledge the hour right now.
So I have a question. Here at this table, we had 8 white people discussing various things about truth. And Terry just referenced the idea of racism. And one thing that my recent experience at the university, also in general in society, very quickly, you argue about the border or about 100 other things, that the counter argument is you're racist. It's a very simple one, and it's one for which there is no response, because by responding, you just prove their point. And now in a Christian community, you said we're supposed to be a thinking community, and so it's a very difficult when people are in that position. How do we argue that one?
The racist question, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, just a quick response back. I noticed Jesus at times would answer with a question back. He didn't always give an answer.
Yeah.
So I would think a question could be, tell me how that's racist. And then you keep asking, and where did you get that idea from? And how does that reveal racism?
Yeah.
What is your definition of racism? And when you actually ask those kinds of Socratic questions, they begin to realize that they've had some big assumptions or labels or something that are being deconstructed with a good question. In fact, I just was reading about Socrates. Critical thinking is basically traced back to Socrates.
Sure. Yep.
He was the guy that came up with the idea of asking good questions and doing it in a way that helps the other person to really think through what they're saying. And then you realize where the errors are. So I think one of the pitfalls we can get into is feeling like we have to give a full and definitive answer to every question that's launched at us. Well, Jesus didn't. So I don't think we have to.
Maybe to a response when those accusations are thrown like that so flippantly. Oh, that's racist, or you're racist, and part of that is to just recognize our own fallibility and say, yeah, I probably am in some ways. There are probably some things that I don't recognize about myself that I respond to people that are different in ways that I'm not even recognizing what's happened. And then to explore it with those kinds of questions. What do you how do you define racism? What is it? What do you see in that situation? That's.
Well, I had a situation where someone made a statement about, all Republicans are racist. And I responded and said, well, I'm curious about that because my sister lives in the States and she votes Republican. And I'm just curious because she's been heavily involved in northern Minnesota with helping Somali refugees settle into some pretty difficult situations. And I don't think she's a racist. So it was a one way to sort of take down this broad brush generalization game that goes on. And you give a few little anecdotes like that, and that it caused the person to step back a bit. But I think at the end of the day, he still felt, all Republicans are racist. It's like Galileo. It's not like Galileo. The earth still revolves around the sun, even though he recanted. Leaving the hearing, he said it still revolves around the sun.
Yeah, that's right.
He was right that case.
Yes, he was.
What's the goal of the conversation? What is success at the end of the conversation? Is that you cleared yourself, because then you're maybe adopting a defensive posture, and then it becomes an argument. So that doesn't feel like a win. And so it depends on, I guess it also depends on the conversation and the relationship. But I've had to work with people where my goal was simply to get through that meeting without them being offended and jumping down my back about something. So I was constantly on my guard with those people. And then I also knew who could call me on things, and I could learn from them, and it would become a learning experience. So yeah.
Can I give an example? So I was at a conference. This is Pathways to Prosperity. So it's a conference of agencies and people that help newcomers, immigrants settle in Canada. So at this conference, they're talking about language of settlement agencies. Now, we happen to be in the little town of Aylmer with 8,000 people. We have a rural constituency of another 10,000. I said, we do not have the resources to provide services in all these languages. We need to pick a few and provide it well and refer. And the immediate response was, that's racist.
Well,
and that was the context, right? And they're coming from Toronto, where they speak 200 languages. The conference was in Toronto. In our community, and I think in any rural community, there's no way you can provide services in more than 2 or 3 languages.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a question could be, how would you propose, given our limitations, that we could meet the needs of more than 2 or 3 language groups? Do you have resources in Toronto that might be available virtually to our community?
Good response. I wish I was that quick.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, our best ideas come after the conversation, don't they?
Yeah.
Oh.
I think too, the manner in which we reply is really important. The tone, and love covers a multitude of sins, and just if we respond with love and seek to understand that and follow up with the questions that has been said, so it goes a long way. If a gentle answer turns away wrath too is another one.
Right.
Sometimes that just brings it down. So
So it's really a self-management thing as well. How do I not get offended and get defensive and get loud?
Yeah.
How do I stay less anxious?
Sometimes
Yeah,
too, what
that's-
you're hearing is not information, it's emotion.
Yeah.
So it's knowing when to respond to the emotion and when to respond to the information.
Mhm.
And when it's a strong emotion, then acknowledging I'm hearing this, this, and this, and it's a reflection back, and then they feel heard. So it's wisdom.
A little saying that I picked up years ago in a pastor's group I was with. This was with Del McKenzie. Some of you would know him from, he used to a pastor in Edmonton area in Shirt Bar. And his little motto was live with nothing to prove, nothing to promote, and nothing to protect. And that was sometimes and often, when we're in these situations and emotions are ramping up, it's a good quote to say, what am I trying to prove? What am I trying to protect in this? What am I, what's my agenda? What am I trying to promote? And so that's that served me well sometimes to say, what is that? Yeah. So, but yeah, like anyone else, I make emotions. I make the decisions and enter in those conversations, and before long, the emotions are in the driver's seat, and away you go, right? So yeah.
Crashing down the hill.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I've found when you're face to face with people, you're able to discern what's going on in that moment and what that relationship is.
Mm-hmm.
The tragedy of our world is that often the vitriol is flying around in spaces that are not face to face.
Yeah.
And it's soundbite kind of arrows and shots across the bow. And that sort of has fueled the environment somewhat. But it's different when you then sit down with someone and you're face to face. A little bit different, I think, for Dean, when you're in a group of people. It's as if there's a multiplier effect of the potential for an incendiary bomb to go off, because you never know. You're talking to someone about an issue, someone over here is listening to it, and they're triggered by what you said, and then it becomes a big fire.
Mm-hmm.
But face to face, I think I find it just comes down. Everything sort of comes down when you're able to talk with people.
Like one-on-one, you mean?
One-on-one. Yeah, one-on-one.
Or two, but not a big group. Yeah.
Bigger group is always, there's a wild card
Yeah.
effect now, because you never know. And you never know when, as you said, Dan, someone then emails you later and says, I'm very, very angry at you for what I sensed you may have said or meant or whatever. And yeah,
people have an assumption as well that if they feel offended, you did something wrong. Someone else did something wrong.
Yeah.
And, that can be a challenge.
This is the Haidt. Yeah, this is the Jonathan Haidt piece. The second untruth is that life is fragile, and I'm fragile. So you need to not say anything that will hurt my feelings.
Yeah.
So bubble wrap, we bubble wrap our kids. Go ahead.
Sorry, Terry. Yeah. And we all mentioned that we think, after the fact, we think, well, this is what I should have said. This is what, and one of the problems that I think we face in our society is that everything is so fast paced and the reactions are so immediate, even within the way the headlines are framed. I mean, used to be there was a week-long news cycle or a 24-hour news cycle. Now you don't have 24 minutes. It's, you have, you don't get the tweet back in 24 seconds. People think you're slow or whatever, in that world, right? And so everything is framed in that instant reactionary stage rather than, and that's what makes the headlines now. It's the instant reaction. It's not something that's been given some thoughtful reflection to say, okay, what's the big picture? What's going on this? And then how do we relate that to a broader audience? It's how do we get the headline that's going to be clicked?
So, I came across a thing yesterday in the 1960s, early 70s, that the normal soundbite of the president in terms of US was 40 seconds. Today, it's less than 10 seconds.
Yeah.
So it's just an indication, that's a symptom of the way in which we have brought things down to a soundbite. Another guy writes about the fact that with the media, if you have a very strong and even radical position, the media will send a car over to get you immediately. But if you tell the media, I have a nuanced position on this or that issue, they'll tell you, we'll ring you back. And they never do. So even the media is looking for the they're looking for the edge. They're looking for the thing that is dogmatic and very, very strong and black and white. If you say it's complex, well, how can we have a newscast on someone talking about complexity? It's much easier to have something that's black and white. So, we're in a world now where I think, and this is the whole discussion of the internet as to how that's affected. And Nicholas Carr has a book called The Shallows, where he says how the internet has basically rewired our brains in a radical way. We're thinking differently because we're becoming so accustomed to things that are rapid and small and soundbite like. And so to call people into a discussion of let's have some deep thinking is harder than ever because we're just not accustomed to it. And we've been conditioned, and all the things are conditioned to it for a Luddic loop of just click, trigger, move on to the next thing. And our eyes are just darting. We don't have time for long reflection. So I think we've got a crisis of reflection. Someone said we don't have a leadership problem. We have a thinking problem now. Our leadership problem is a thinking problem. And most leaders will tell you, where do I find time to think?
Yeah.
We also learn we can't actually implement any positive changes or solutions in the world unless we have transformational leaders leading them and transformational teams supporting the transformational leaders. So the challenge is finding how do we surround ourselves by other transformational thinkers? What do we do when we have people on our teams who are not at that level, who are have different gifts? And so it is, and then things don't always go according to plan, and we do go back and think, oh, I wish I could have thought of that really smart answer question at the time, and you didn't, and you can't live in the past. You can't undo anything you even said or did 5 seconds ago. And so one of my favorite prayers is, how do I follow you from here, Jesus? Because that gets me out of that. Oh, that's good. If only I hadn't done that. So, and trying to, if a conversation moves forward or there's growth, or if there's self-reflection that comes out of it for me, if our goal is not to keep the peace at all costs. Our goal is to follow Jesus in wherever he's leading us in our own soul development or in merging our kingdoms with other people. So that's all success. Having conflict in a meeting or a conversation is not a failure. Yeah.
So Verdine, what was the resource that you were using for the 3 stages of development? That might be helpful for listeners.
That was out of Who Not How, which is Dan Sullivan and Benjamin Hardy book.
Good.
And they're quoting Harvard psychologist Dr. Robert Keegan. Benjamin Hardy, who is really the ghost author for Dan Sullivan, has a doctoral degree in social psychology. So really loves trying to understand how people think and why they do what they do. So,
very good.
This same book also has a really great, further on, talks about transformational leadership theory and what it requires. 4 elements of transformational leadership, including individualized considerations, so coaching, mentoring, listening to concerns and needs, intellectual stimulation, so you're challenging people's assumptions, taking risks, soliciting ideas, inspirational motivation, so articulating a vision that's appealing, inspiring to your team, and idealized influence, being that role model. So it's there's always more to grow towards.
A lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thanks everybody. This has been a good conversation, and I appreciate the input from each of you. It's been very good.